It's a treat for me to be here. It's a treat for all of us to be here, to get to talk baseball with you all. So what I thought I would do is I'll introduce our panel, and then we'll just sort of get started. We'd like this to be informal, and so I think everybody would entertain questions whenever you have one. So let me just start on my immediate right, Mark Presswood, an old friend of mine for many years from baseball circles, and in fact, Mark's son Trey played on the Blue Sox when we had that team in the Texas Collegiate League. So Mark has a mechanical engineering degree from Texas A&M University, but in recent years he's been heavily involved in commercial real estate development, and he's a very civically minded person who's on virtually every commission in Fort Worth. He's a commissioner on the Fort Worth Housing Authority, and he's the current chairman of the City of Fort Worth's Development Advisory Council, and he's involved in many other civic organizations as well. But I really know him mostly through baseball, and you're looking at probably the number one expert on the history of the Texas League, certainly on the Fort Worth Cats, without question. And he brought these two jerseys, which he can tell you about, but these are actually authentic jerseys. And if you're nice, you can come up and touch them later. So it's great to have Mark. Oh, and I forgot to mention he's written two books: a book on the history of baseball in Dallas, and a book on the history of baseball in Fort Worth. So it's great to have Mark with us. In the middle here is Scott Cain, also a very civically minded young man. He is the mayor of Cleburne, and one of the principals responsible for bringing independent professional baseball to Cleburne, the Cleburne Railroaders that you're going to hear more about. And he's written a book, a baseball book as well, about the history of baseball in Cleburne. And for those of you that may not be aware, there is a very rich history of baseball in Cleburne. There was a gap there of about
100 years.
About 100 years. But so you have to go back to Tris Speaker days. And he'll talk to us about it. Scott is a lawyer, a commercial litigator when he's not being mayor or running the railroaders. The commercial litigator in Cleburne, and is a graduate of the Texas Wesleyan, now Texas A&M School of Law. To my far right is Clay Coppedge, who drove up to be with us from the Georgetown area. He's worked in Central Texas for many, many years as a sports writer, feature writer, and reporter. Articles and have appeared in a wide range of magazines throughout the country and in Texas. He's a real Texas history buff. He's written 3 books of Texana for the History Press, and he's written one of those books is a great book on the history of baseball in Texas. So that's our panel, and it's a very very distinguished one. So thanks you all for being with us. Trey, Mark,
and he did that all the time when Trey was playing too.
I did it all. And Trey's a lot better looking than him. I don't know how I got him confused. So Mark, tell us a little bit about your books and your interest in how you have developed such an incredible interest in Texas baseball history.
It quickly started because I went from an engineering degree at A&M to Washington, D.C., and I met a group up there, which was SABR. And when you apply to join SABR, the first thing I asked you is what's your specialty, and I didn't have any. So I loved Fort Worth, I loved baseball, so that just equaled the Cats. So being an engineer and being the guy I am, when you do that, you better go find out what you're talking about. So I started doing a lot of research, and one of the first things I did, and it's one of my most prized possessions, is I tried to get addresses and write as many of the former Cats that I could, and get letters of them telling me about some special, and I bet I received 120 letters, and I have them all in a binder, and it's in a safe. I mean, it's something I'll treasure forever, and some of the stories were hilarious. And then we moved back to Fort Worth, and I got to actually meet some of these folks. And that was, to me, I think these gentlemen will say the same thing. When you do research like this, probably the best part of doing this research is meeting the people that lived it and talking to them and getting the oral histories and being able to capture it. And, we've unfortunately on the cat side lost quite a few, but Paul and I's good friend Carol Behringer was a really special person, and getting to know him and be part of his world was pretty awesome. So, and then Bobby Bragan, and I will tell you that everybody knows Bobby Bragan, right? That's his brother's jersey. 1954, Jimmy Bragan actually played for Bobby in 1954, and there was one quick story that he had to let Jimmy go down to the lower level, which is in Greenville, and there was another pitcher on that team that he had to send down, and the way he told him that he was sending him down says, "When you get to Greenville, say hello to my brother Jimmy." So, just hearing those kind of stories from those really special people, that's what made it all work for me.
And Mark has a world-class collection of things, not only things like this, but photos. I mean, the photo archive you have is just of the Texas League and Texas baseball is just remarkable.
Well, and it's kind of, the answer is yes, and it's a lot of garage sales and got lucky back in, mid-90s when the new ballpark opened. They did a few stories on what baseball was, and one of them featured, people had my name and they would call and say, "Hey, I got this old ball," or "I got this old," and that really helped get things going. But it's kind of neat because another good friend of mine was the president of the Texas League, Tom Kaiser. Tom Kaiser, I know. And so what happens is somebody wants to do a research, they'll call Paul or they'll call Tom, and the first thing they do is say, "Well, you need to call Mark."
This is the guy.
So, I got to be part of some really special projects. Clay's done a great book that y'all need to look at and go see, and I've been able to help loan some photos for that. So that's been a lot of fun as well.
Well, Scott, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in baseball and how you came to write your book.
Mine was a little different path. Cleburne, we had the Chisholm Trail Parkway that came to Cleburne a couple of years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, and we were looking at how to get the economy started in Cleburne and looking at other cities, and we wanted to have a great entryway, and we looked at an indoor snow ski facility at one point, and it didn't really fit in, and it didn't have the romance of baseball. But I received a Facebook message. I usually don't like Facebook. When you serve in public office, Facebook can be a difficult thing. But on this particular occasion, one of our local business owners sent me a message, said, "Hey, the Cats are getting kicked out of LaGrave Field. Why don't you see if they want to come to Cleburne?" Ha, ha, ha. Like, that could never happen. Well, I didn't know anything better, so I picked up the phone and just started making phone calls. And through that process, we started talking about it. I knew Tris Speaker was part of Cleburne's history, but other than that, no one alive really knew that much about our baseball history. So I started researching it, and as the process unfolded, I found out that we had 5 seasons of professional baseball and 2 championships. And as I started digging to try to make the pitch to bring professional baseball back, I started digging into some of the stories and reading about the history of the Texas League and 100 years ago what baseball was like in Texas towns as we really got our foot in the door. And I really thought these are stories that need to be told because you just can't make them up. And if you can indulge me, I'll tell one of my favorite stories, and I got this from Mark in his book. And he had mentioned in one of his Fort Worth books about a game when the Panthers came to Cleburne. They played in a park called Gorman Park, which is still there in Cleburne. There's a plaque that has Tris Speaker's name on it. But on that particular game, they came and they were ahead 2-0, and we got to the bottom of the 9th inning, and somehow we scored a couple of runs, and the Railroaders tied the game, and it was 2-all. We got a runner onto first base. I found the box scores in the Cleburne papers, which was kind of neat to kind of flesh some of that out. And got a runner on first, and we played a little small ball, and it used 2 outs to get him to third base. And the last batter stepped into the box, and he hit a soft, shallow pop-up into center field. Easy out, right? Not on that day. On that day, there were several hundred cowboys that had ridden in from all the outlying areas, and they're on horseback on the outfield fence line. And when, in 1906, if you're riding into a railroad town from the rural areas, you're going to have your 6-shooters on your hip because you may have snakes or, bambinos or something like that. Well, apparently 5 of these cowboys took issue with what was going on the field, and they drew down and literally blew the ball out of the air. So put yourself in the umpire's shoes. He's at home plate. There's no fan interference in 1906. You're in a rough and tumble railroad town, miles away from home, and these cowboys just shot the ball out of the air. What do? You point to third base and you call the runner home and let them win in the strangest walk-off maybe in the history of baseball. Then you hightail it to the depot and you get on the train and get out with your hiding tag. So that's how baseball started in Cleburne. And so as I started digging the stories, we saw marriages that were hung in the balance, whether or not they were, young men were allowed to marry their sweethearts depending on whether they could maintain their batting average in Cleburne. And so we looked at our railroad history, and railroads in those days and baseball went like a hand in glove. And teams would pop up and they would fold and they would struggle. And I tell you, it's amazing, today's baseball and independent minor league baseball, a lot hasn't changed. Teams come and go and some of the struggles, but I haven't seen anybody pull a gun at a game. I've told our fans in Cleburne, don't think about it. Our police chief probably won't like that. But as we went through that process, I started digging the old newspaper clippings. And I saw that rich history of professional baseball, but then I started digging deeper, and the book kind of took on a life of its own. I'd heard my dad talk about Little League in the 50s. And I thought, it's just your old man talking about how great it was, and the whole town would come out. And I'm thinking, I remember when I was 12 and played Little League, and 5 or 10 folks seemed like the whole town. Well, I talked to 2 or 3 other residents, and they said the same thing. So I started studying about Stotts on the East Coast and how Little League started, and read the stories of how it started in Cleburne, and read some of the stories of professional major league talent that came out of our community that I didn't know about. And so we started putting those stories together. But for me, one of the biggest tragedies was when I got to our Negro League team, the Cleburne Eagles, and almost all of the history was gone other than oral history. And I sat and was talking with one of our city council members who was the last living connection with the Cleburne Eagles. And he told a story about going to play the all-white team in Glen Rose. And he was sitting on my couch, and by the end of telling the story, I was mortified. I didn't live through the era of segregation, and he's telling me that, but he's in the floor with tears flowing down his face because he was laughing so hard about what happened at the end of the story. And maybe if we have time, I'll tell you that story. But to be able to preserve that, and then fast forward to the dedication of our new stadium, we were able to recognize one of our great Negro players, Jay Brazel, who went on to Vernon, Texas to start a baseball program and lead that community through desegregation. And our community had never recognized this incredible man on and off the field. So we named the field after him. And the stadium today sits at 1906 Jay Brazel Boulevard. So Jay Brazel's forever connected with the great 1906 team. Which, by the way, we had 9 players that went on to have major league careers out of that team. It was really amazing. But it was really fun. And my wife, who's here with us this afternoon, can attest. She heard all the stories. I would holler across the house, "You won't believe what I just read. You cannot make this up." And so I wanted to tell the story of the fans, the town, the team. And so I put together those stories in that collection to kind of tell that story. And then I divided my book into 9 chapters that I call innings. And then the last chapter, Extra Innings, is a behind-the-scene look of how we brought baseball back. And if you ever want to know what it's like working with the great Donnie Nelson, you'll get a little insight there. And if you get a privilege to work with him like I had, you stay up a lot of long nights because he works really hard. But it's been amazing, and it's been the privilege of a lifetime. nowhere but America can a small town Little League player grow up to be mayor of his hometown and build a professional baseball stadium and write a book about it. It's been a great journey, Paul.
That's great. That's wonderful. Before we leave Trish Speaker entirely, I got this out of Clay's book, actually, because I haven't read yours yet, but they played a 19-inning game in 1906, I think, that Speaker played in, and the game took 2 hours. Yeah. I was at the Rangers Monday night, and it took 4 hours, and of course we lost. And then, so Clay, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in your baseball project.
Well, I like most people who grow up loving baseball, I was introduced to it at an early age, and everybody in the neighborhood told me that I was pretty good, so I assumed I was going to be a major league baseball player. And, I think I really would have been if only I'd had, size, speed, and talent. I think that would have happened because I certainly had the desire. I stayed with it. I played, into high school and then stayed with summer ball and, just about as long as they'd let me show up and put on a uniform somewhere. But even I moved away from Lubbock, where I grew up and learned to play baseball. I never left baseball, and baseball never left me. And when I was a kid, I went to a Texas Tech football game. My dad worked at the Lubbock paper, and he'd moonlight sometimes on Saturdays in the press box there at Tech. And I bugged him enough that he took me along one time and let me sit in the press box. And if I promised not to say one word for at least 3 hours, and I said, okay. So I went up there, and the first thing I saw when I opened the door was our sports editor, who was a family friend. And he was sitting there, and he had a spread of food like I'd never seen. He had barbecue and all the fixings and a great big Coke like this. And I said, Mr. Pettit, I said, what in the world are you doing here? And he says, well, son, I'm working. And I said, okay, well, I could be a sports writer. I think that's where I want to go. Since I'm not going to be a Major League Baseball player, I'll just go ahead and be a sports writer. And that was wonderful. It gave me a chance to stay close to the game and to have a reason, to watch baseball, talk about baseball all the time. And moved on from that and was kind of missing writing about it when History Press at the Austin Book Festival, one of their editors asked me, he says, would you be interested in writing a book about the history of Texas baseball? And I said, well, let me think about it for a minute. Yes, I would. and so then I went off on this long journey of immersion into Texas baseball. I wish I'd known Scott. Wish I'd in the years since I wrote it. It's published in 2012. I've got enough for another volume and a lot of stuff I wish I'd put in this one that I've found since then. But I loved it, and I love the history of baseball, and I think that's baseball has a deeper sense of history, I think, than a lot of the other sports. History plays into the day-to-day realities of baseball, maybe more than other sports. And, everybody has their personal histories, and it's why I think the sport has endured. You learn it as a child, as a boy, and then you play it as long as you can. You stay in love with it. You have your kids. You introduce them to it, and it just feeds upon itself. So, anytime I can come somewhere and talk about baseball for an hour and nobody tells me to be quiet and talk about something else, I'm a happy camper.
I think we're sort of, this is sort of an oral history panel, so I think it would be great if we each told a story or two from our research that resonates with the history of Texas baseball. I'll start. Rogers Hornsby is one of the great players out of Texas. I mean, in my mind, it's Rogers Hornsby, Trish Speaker, I guess Nolan Ryan and maybe now Clayton Kershaw, but Ernie Banks, you can't forget Ernie. But Hornsby was a really difficult person and somewhat irascible, and lots of stories about playing the horses and the like. But pretty much the only thing he liked in life was baseball and playing the horses. Those were his interests. And somebody once asked him what he did in the winter, and he said he sat by the window, looked outside, and waited for spring to come. So to me, that's a real baseball guy. So, Mark, do you have any stories that come to mind?
Yeah, well, two things. One, just to piggyback on that, Rogers was actually born in Winters, Texas, but moved to Fort Worth when he was 3 in 1903, because his mom went to go work in the stockyards, the meat packing plants, which were being built there on the north side. And so he was a Fort Worth boy, went to Northside High. And what people don't know about it, he got cut from his first 2 professional minor league teams. Now, this is turned out to be the greatest right-handed hitter in all of baseball.
Didn't he play in Gainesville? Did he play in Gainesville?
Mm-hmm. I think he played in Gainesville, yeah. But he got cut from his 2 minor league teams, so keep trying.
But he was hitting in the low 200s too.
Yeah,
It's
he was.
amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's right.
Tris Speaker got Tris Speaker got traded for what? He got traded for, I wish I could remember. But early in his career, he got McGraw turned him down. He tried to try out for John McGraw in Marlin when the Giants had their headquarters, their spring training in Marlin for years.
That's right. Sure did. Marlin Springs.
And McGraw cut him. Didn't even give him a chance. And he later, I wish I could remember, got traded for not money, not a ball player, but for I think maybe like 12 dozen baseballs or something like that. Anyway.
So obviously we can't sit here and talk about the 100 and some odd years of Texas League history, but I want to give a perspective. Prior to 1957, the westernmost major league team was St. Louis. So out here, the Texas League was our professional league. I mean, it was huge. There were crowds, these 2 teams hated each other. And when they played each other, there were crowds of 10 and 12 and 15,000 people as far back as the 30s. I remember Bobby Bragan told me that when he was asked they brought up a little catcher in Brooklyn called Ed Campanella. Roy Campanella. Roy Campanella. So they said, Bobby, we're going to send you down to coach and to manage in the minors. And he got to Fort Worth, and the president of the club said, all right, Bobby, you've got 2 jobs. One is to train young men to become Brooklyn Dodgers, and the second one is to beat Dallas. But I do want to spend a little bit on these 2 teams because it's kind of funny when you do the research. Dallas was kind of more known for their events. They were an independent team forever. So they had some big stars. In fact, Willie McCovey played here, but not a ton of them. It's because they maintained this independent status. So never affiliated baseball was late, like really hit hard or hit throughout minor league baseball after World War II. But even then, and I think it's because of George, probably, but they maintained their independent status, so they didn't have the great ball players. George Sheps, yeah. And you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But they have these special events. The very first, in fact, this building is kind of where I want to go in this story. This building was built for the 1936 centennial. Well, as part of that centennial, they wanted to have the very first Texas League All-Star game, and it was here in Dallas as part of the festivities. And then somebody that Paul and I knew, a guy named George Sheps, was the owner for quite some time. And at that time, they were called the Dallas Rebels. And he sold to East Texas oil man Dick Burnett. And the first thing Dick wanted to do was to do this big special event to bring prominence to the Dallas team. So he basically hired all Hall of Famers, Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, I can't remember the whole list, but to basically...
Dickie Cochran.
Yes, and Bill Dickey was catcher.
Yeah. And
to basically run on the field and play...
Dizzy Dean.
Dizzy Dean.
Yeah.
To play the first half inning, and they did it at the Cotton Bowl, and 51,000 people showed up. Also, they could say that they saw these guys play. Fort Worth.
Baseball in the Cotton Bowl.
I know. Fort Worth, on the other hand, was more, I think, known for their players. And I think a lot of it had to do with, it was timing, because they became a Brooklyn Dodger farm team right out of the World War II, and that's when Brooklyn went on their heyday. So guys like Duke Snyder played center field for the Cats, Carl Erskine, Joe Landrum, Dee Fondy. I mean, they were Chico Carrasquel. I mean, there were a lot of players that came through Fort Worth that went on to major league levels. So, but every time you talk to a Cat or a Dallas, the first thing they mentioned was, I hated those guys. So it was fun hearing those stories.
You know, Paul, to kind of jump on that, there was a lot of rivalry with Fort Worth and Dallas. And the 1906 season was interesting because a jeweler in Fort Worth was so sure that the Panthers were going to win the Texas League title, he had this beautiful, beautiful sterling silver trophy made, and it's in the style of Atlas, but it's a baseball player holding up a baseball instead of the world. And it had this ornate engraving, and he had bought that for his Fort Worth Panthers. And so everybody in the Texas League in 1906 knew that it was going to be Dallas and Fort Worth vying for it. In the first half of the season, Fort Worth won, and so everybody was pulling for Dallas to win. And then my town came in with Tris Speaker and upset the apple cart. And I was actually doing research for the book and trying to find, we won that trophy, and I was trying to find a trophy from a 1906 vintage, type deal so I could get some idea of it. I'm Googling, vintage 1906 baseball trophy, and this one pops up and it says, all of that, and then I look at it and it says won by Cleburne on this picture, and my heart just went through my throat. And then I noticed that it was on an auction block, and I thought, how am I going to tell my wife I just spent $40,000 or $50,000 bringing the trophy home? Because in 1906, when we won that trophy, Doak Roberts grabbed the trophy, grabbed the team, hopped on a train, and moved the team to Houston, where they became the Houston Buffaloes. And they stayed the Buffaloes in Houston until 1962, when they changed their name and they got their major league affiliation, and they were the Colt 45s. In 65, they changed their name to the Houston Astros. So I actually called the Houston mayor when we were bringing baseball back, said, hey, I'm the mayor of Cleveland, we'd like our baseball team back. So obviously that didn't work because we started the Railroaders back. But back to the trophy, and I was really excited, and then all of a sudden I realized that the auction had closed in 2006. So I'm still working to try to figure that out, but that rivalry was really amazing. If I could tell just 3 short stories, the Tris Speaker was really amazing. In that 1906 season, he actually was a pitcher. We picked him up for $50 out of Corsicana, and Doak Roberts signed him to a $50 contract and gave him a $1 coin to get on a train for train fare to get down to Cleburne, actually to Waco, where they were playing. Well, Tris, being frugal, put it in his pocket and ran alongside a freight train and hopped on and went down there. But Tris was pitching, and he had an off night, and one of the team favorites had gotten knocked completely unconscious at the plate, and his baseball career was over. Well, the manager was saying, hey, I got to put somebody out in the field. Who wants to go? Well, here this young kid said, hey, I'll go. And this one teammate took issue with it. And so the teammate went to the manager and said, you got to kick this kid off the team. He doesn't fit in. I don't like him. I've got a problem with him. He was an Irishman, had a temper. So he kept stirring the pot. And finally, one day, Tris was sitting on a Pullman ready to leave town to go to the next baseball game. And here comes Coyle, the player that was giving him a hard time. And he walked by just nonchalantly. And old Spoke reached out the window and cold cocked him, and that was it. That's one of the reasons he got his name Spoke as a nickname. When he said something, that was it. End of the story. The other Tris Speaker story that was a lot of fun, towards the middle of the season, they were playing the Panthers, and they were staying up in Fort Worth. But Temple had been just kicked out. It was right at the end of the half of the season. They were kicked out because another team folded and the numbers didn't match up. And so Temple had filed a lawsuit and threatened to shut down the Texas League. And so they had that going on, and back home there was a big fight with Doak Roberts and the business owners in Cleburne as to whether or not the team was going to make it. So if you're a young baseball player and you're in Fort Worth, Texas in 1906, and you think your baseball career is over and you're going back to the cotton field, what do? Well, you go to Hell's Half Acre and you get rip-roaring drunk and whatever else goes on at Hell's Half Acre, thinking you're not going to play. Problem was, they ended up playing the next day. So the team took the field, probably some sort of an ice bag. They were completely hungover, and Speaker got onto the mound. And throughout the end of his career till his death, he said they hung 26 runs on him, but it was really 16. But he would look to the manager and he would say, hey, pull me out, pull me out. He said, son, you're doing fine. Nobody's getting singles on you. They're all doubles and triples. Keep playing. And then you fast forward to my favorite oral story out of my book was the Negro team, the Eagles, when they went to Glen Rose that I referenced a minute ago. And pardon my language, this is coming from my black council member. He said they get to the city limits of Glen Rose and says, nigger, if you can read this, you better run. If you can't read it, you better run faster. So he's going, oh my, all black team going to play the all white team. So he's sitting there keeping score, and there's this one obnoxious fan just yelling, harassing them, using the N word. Why are y'all playing with a bunch of N's? Why? N go home, just yelling and going on and on. Well, one of his buddies steps in, right-hander, and he gets ahead of the ball and pulls one, and it goes right into the stands. This guy's sitting on the top, hits him in the forehead, knocks him off the top of the stands. You could have heard a pin drop. The Cleburne Eagles thought, we're never getting out of here. Then this white woman stands up and yells, I'm glad it hit that son of a bitch. I was tired of listening to him. Y'all play baseball. And so, it was a great story, but,
That's a great story.
just one after another. I'm like you, Mark. We could talk about the stories on and on.
Yeah,
But,
for sure.
Those were fun.
There's one, speaking of Negro League Baseball, there's a great book by a friend of Mark and my Kathy Stevens called Our White Boy, and it was set in 1960, 1961, and it's written with, Kathy wrote it with this Jacksboro rancher. In fact, he's the former mayor of Jacksboro.
Mayor Jacksboro.
Yeah. And he, in 1960-61, he was a pitcher at Texas Tech, and but in the summer he was home working, and he ended up playing in the West Texas Colored League. He was the only white person in the whole league. He was a pitcher, and the local, I think he pitched for Wichita Falls, I think, in that league. And so he's written a great book with Kathy about his experiences. It's called Our White Boy. Clay, do you have any stories you want to share with us?
Well, I wish
I'd
I heard some of these stories for my book.
Well, there's always a volume 2.
That's what I'm telling my editor. I said I really need to go into this again. With me, I guess a lot of the things that I found that nothing that really rattled my cage too much, but a lot of things that surprised me. One was how early baseball came to Texas. I always thought of it as, the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s. They were playing it, right after the Civil War. In fact, they formed the Houston Baseball Club in 1861. And then, the Civil War came along, so, nobody had time for baseball. But then 2 years after the Civil War, in 1867, they played a game at the San Jacinto battlefield between, I think it was the Galveston Robert E. Lees and the Houston Stonewalls. And I can't remember which was which, but one of them beat the other one 35-3. So it was kind of reminiscent of that San Jacinto battle as far as it being a rout. And it was very popular in the last half of the 19th century. Baseball was on a local level, strictly on a local level with the town teams. And most towns had 3 teams. They had the white team, black team, and usually a Hispanic team. And it was, you know, in the early days of Texas, you know, horse racing was probably the most popular sport. And one of the reasons was you could bet on it. And baseball was something else they could bet on. The amount of betting that went on in early baseball was amazing. I mean, they're talking about shooting the ball out of the sky. That was pretty common back in those days to try to do that, and usually to have some kind of wager on it as to whether you could knock that ball out of the sky. You know, sometimes you'd be wagering livestock or whatever, but it was certainly a way to pass the time and to make a little money. The other thing that kind of surprised me, I guess, it's just the way of the world, you know, with fathers and sons and the generations. But that first generation of baseball players in Texas, they, you know, the image we have today of the father and the son playing catch and what I alluded to earlier, you know, the link between the generations, well, there's a real generation gap with those early baseball players because their fathers thought this was a total waste of time. This was just, you know, why don't you get a job? You're playing this stupid game. And it was, you know, I mean, families split over it, and sons split from their fathers for the rest of their lives over this. And that surprised me. I didn't once I learned it, because that's just the way of the world, you know, and now that I'm an old man, I know that old men just sit around and complain about the world that's changed, you know, all the changes, but that it's going to change anyway. And the kids always realize that, whether we get around to it or not. But that really surprised me. And then the extent of the influence that Texas had on the Negro Leagues, not just in Texas, but nationally, with Rube Foster, Smokey Joe Williams, Willie Wells. I mean, these were guys that could have played with anybody in the history of the game. And in fact, if they had, there's some of the people that are in the Hall of Fame now we may never have heard of, because they might not could have made a team against some of those guys.
There's, work's really crazy right now, but if I ever want to write another book, I'm going to probably focus, and I wanted to share this so everybody knows, when we talk about professional minor league baseball, these were professionals. I mean, that was their job. They didn't have satellite jobs. They would be ball players throughout the season. Semi-pro is you'd have a job, but you'd go show up, and if they made enough money at the gate, you'd get paid a little bit. And then, of course, town teams were just amateur teams that played over, so as you do history. But Texas had over 100 professional minor league teams. Teams like the Vernon Dusters, Pampa Oilers, Paris Red Rockets, the Longview Casket Makers, Marshall Browns,
Alpine Cowboys.
Alpine Cowboys. I mean, you can go throughout Texas, and there were actual professional leagues where people would show up and watch professional baseball players. And there's a story. I actually wrote 2 stories for the Texas Almanac. I'm trying to think of how long ago. I think it was 2008. One was on those teams, so I'd ask you to kind of check that out, because there are a lot of fun stories in there. And I referenced a couple of the Negro League startups that happened in Texas, and so they asked me to write one on them. Mm-hmm. And finding history of the Negro Leagues is tough. The newspapers just wouldn't cover the games. You know, they'd have a blurb here and a blurb there, especially when they played in the stadium. Typically, they would play in the stadium of the local big minor league team. But like we were talking earlier, Rube Foster, who grew up in Calvert, and he actually is considered the father of Negro League baseball, started up in Chicago. He played in the early 1900s, and he started playing for the Waco Yellow Jackets, and then I think he played a couple years for the Fort Worth Wonders. Then he went on into Chicago, or up in that area, and then But there was a blurb, and so you do research, and there's a blurb that says, crack pitcher Foster and the Waco Yellow Jackets to play Fort Worth Sunday. And so then you go through the microfilm and you say, okay, what happened? You know, how'd the game? Nothing. You know, so it's really, anybody wants to do research, study the Tulsa Dispatch had a pretty good section on covering games, but other than that, it's really, really tough.
You know, I ran into that same thing. You know, the Waco had Katy Park, and they had the semi-pro tournament every year, and they had some pretty good coverage. But in 1906, we had a player that played on the same field as Tris Speaker, Oscar Fudge Frame. And the only way I was able to find information about Oscar Frame was he lost an arm in a hunting accident and was a one-arm player. And he played all over the country, and people would show up and they would write about this one-arm wonder who played baseball. And it was amazing because they went to see this one-arm player, and then they would leave the game talking about what a great player he was, not the fact that he had one arm. And the only way I was able to find out a lot of history about him was through our council member who used to carry groceries to him when he was a kid before he died. And he told me about how he learned to play the piano, and I was able to learn a little bit more about him. But the history is unfortunately lost. And some great, great players prior to Jackie Robinson that, you know, that's one of the saddest things, you know, that you find. You know, we had you know, it's not always the funny stories, but some of the sad stories. We had a little boy that went to see his first professional baseball team opening day of the 1906 Railroaders in Cleburne. We had a tornado in the preseason game that tore up our stadium, and the little boy lost his life. And so, you know, we're going to try to memorialize him in our new stadium, but you know, it's amazing how I was a part of it. Did y'all run across the story how Sunday was, you weren't allowed to play baseball on Sundays back then?
In most communities.
And I saw where, you know, across the country, they would designate a pitcher and a batter, and they'd pick the worst player on the team or somebody they'd pull in off the street to throw the first pitch and be the first batter because they would get arrested. And then they'd go to the jail, and everybody else would have a good time. It was pretty remarkable. So, you know, and for, you know, for Cleburne, because we weren't able to play Sunday ball, I think that is a big reason why we didn't make it. You know, railroad town, people were working from dusk to dawn for 6 days a week, and Sunday was it. And we actually built a second stadium that I haven't been able to locate where it was, just on the outskirts of town to play Sunday ball.
Let me tell one quick story about the tornado, and you're going to have to help me. He was part of our group for a long time. His brother was a manager at Waco. He just passed away here not too long ago.
The Waco tornado?
Yeah, but
yeah.
The manager, though. He was, his brother was
in the same
Pirates.
Waco Pirates.
Yeah, and he was part of the Pirates. Great manner here. But anyway,
Yeah,
this funny story. So the manager of the Waco Pirates, a tornado hit in '53 and wiped out the stadium. And he was telling the story about how there's a train track that went right beside the stadium, and he hated that dang track because it would keep fans from getting in the stadium, and then right in the middle of a ball game, the train would toot their horn, everybody would jump, and he just hated it. And so during the tornado, when the tornado hit in May of '53, right? Mm-hmm. The stadium's being torn down. Well, he ran in an engine that was parked there, and he says that engine is what saved his life from being. Wow. And he said after that, he would bless it every time it went by.
You know, I had a story about Tris Speaker, and I've got a picture in my book that his family had loaned me. His great nephew heard me on WBAP talking about bringing the Railroaders back, and ended up moving back to Cleburne. And then they've given us artifacts for our baseball museum. But one of the pictures the family shared with me was when he was playing for Cleveland. The consummate Texan, he would do roping demonstrations before the games for the crowd. And there's a picture that I have in my book of him roping a cowboy, and it's none other than Will Rogers.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, you just never know what you're going to see at the ball game.
Speaker grew up in Hubbard, which is just about an hour south of here. And the story is that he was a pretty wild kid, and that when he was like 11 or 12 years old, he walked around town with a 6-gun on his hip.
He was tough, and his nickname Spoke actually came when he was in Cleveland, and his family today still call him Uncle Spoke. And he, of course, the Gray Eagle is what he's most known for, but it's remarkable that he still holds several major league records, putouts from center field, and in my opinion, and a lot of others, I think he's the greatest center fielder to ever play.
He played a really shallow center field, and the story is, and I don't think it's apocryphal, that he often made putouts at second base.
Yeah.
He'd cover second, and he'd force runners out at second.
He was amazing. And his mother didn't want him to play baseball. Kind of going back to what you were saying, Clay.
Right.
His mother was very much opposed to it. And ironically, in 1920, when he managed Cleveland to the World Series title, there's a picture, I call it the kiss of victory. He caught the last out, and ran all the way up into the stands to embrace his mom, who was there. So she had come a long ways from 1905 when he played. This is kind of interesting. I didn't get this in my book because I ran out of room, too. The history press makes you kind of condense it down a little bit. Yeah. But we had our manager from 1911 that won the Texas-Oklahoma League, was playing in a pickup game, and Speaker was on the mound. He was a horrible pitcher. He would knock people out. And there was this big old guy from Oklahoma, and he beamed him and knocked him cold. And Dad Ritter was his name in 1911, was catching that game. And Dad got between, when that guy came to, he was going to take Speaker's head off for hitting him. And so he saved Speaker. So if it weren't for good old Dad Ritter, we may not have had Tris Speaker. So you never know how things will turn out.
There's actually a little museum in Hubbard for a Speaker museum in the old schoolhouse, but you have to call ahead. It is. It's remarkable. To open it. Jim
Swan, his great nephew, told the story of how in his Aunt Tris Speaker's house, they had a room with all the bats and balls and stuff signed by Babe Ruth and all this memorabilia. And when they were kids, they didn't know any better. They'd go to, Uncle Spoke's house, and they'd go up to the trophy room and grab a bat and a ball. And he had this mortified look. He said, "We had no idea. We're playing with history here." And unfortunately, her house caught fire many years ago, and they lost about half of the artifacts. But they loaned us, there is a screen picture. If you go to Cooperstown, next to his bust, the picture that is portrayed there from that 39 class, they made 2 copies of it. And the family has one, and Cooperstown has the other. And they graciously put it on display in our museum. So tell us a little bit about your museum in Cleburne. Yeah, when I was designing our stadium, I wanted to preserve a lot of our history. And so, it wasn't just about baseball and soccer, but I wanted to preserve our history. So I had a lot of our rail cars brought in, and I tell the story of our railroad history. But each one of our suites I named after players from the 1906 team. And then I put, as you go in, there is a museum that you can go in and you can see the history of early baseball. I acquired some artifacts from the East Coast, balls, bats, gloves. I had to make some replica jerseys from the 06 and 11 team and all the way through the Houston Astros. And then we have a lot of artifacts from Tris Speaker's family, game day bat, a lot of playing cards. And they actually offered to loan us a 1906 rookie card from probably the only one in existence. I said, how about we maybe do a copy? I didn't want to put that in the ballpark, but we've had to have some security to protect all that. But fans can go in and have a trip down memory lane, and it goes all the way from the 1906 team in the early late 1800s dead ball era. I've got a dead ball, and all the way to the ribbon cutting and the groundbreaking, where we built the field literally in a turnip field. And Speaker's family was there, and I got to pitch to our Congressman Roger Williams that played for Atlanta, and I'm sitting there thinking, I am in over my head, but only in America. So, any questions before we wrap up? Yes, Frank?
Wasn't pro ball played here in Fair Park? Wasn't there a field here before they played ball over in Oak Cliff?
The answer is yes, but it was only like 1 year, and it was because the field had flooded. The
Burnett Field?
Noel.
It wasn't
back
Burnett
then
Field.
It was called Steer Stadium. And another Negro League connection, the Negro League field was over as well, called Robinson Park. And 1 year, the Steer Stadium burned to the ground. And so for the next 2 years, they played at Robinson Park. So it was good that that existed. But except for the answer to your question is yes, 1 year, but it was just kind of an anomaly. Everything else was all in the Oak Cliff area.
Yes.
So we know gambling and baseball, as Clay mentioned, have a long history. Both the Black Sox scandal, Pete Rose, people bet on baseball every day. There are tens of millions of dollars bet on it. My question is in early Texas, I know gambling was legal. Because Texas, we always stood up for ourselves. We didn't let the federal government tell us we can't bet on cars or on baseball. When did gambling become illegal? Was there still betting on baseball games after it was illegal? Probably yes. What's the story about that?
Well, the Major League Baseball and the professional baseball leagues were the ones that enforced the gambling prohibitions in baseball. The amateur level, it was still fair game, but once when money became involved for real, when they're paying people to play and manage and charging people to get into the game, then there was always a stipulation in your contract about gambling. And that was why the Black Sox scandal was one of about 20 times that people said, well, that's the end of baseball. Because, it's like if it has no integrity, it has no future. And there's a guy, and I met him after I'd written this book too, that I wish I'd been able to include, because he compiled all these articles and essays and lectures over the years about the death of baseball. And the most recent one being about 10 years ago. And the first one being about 1880 or so. But every so often if somebody says, well, that's the death of baseball. Most of those came out in the wake of the Black Sox scandal. Because of gambling.
Even as far back as I've got a contract, I'm trying to think of the oldest one I have. I think it's a 1919 contract. Even then it has a clause against gambling. So you got to remember, you said gambling was legal with patrons, fans. It didn't mean it was legal with the players. And the key, as we all know, is the integrity of the game. Because when the players get involved, and if you have any question about that outcome not being fair, y'all quit going. Everybody will, right? So they had to protect that, and I think they've been protecting that for a long time. The other thing to keep in mind, it's one thing to throw the World Series because you've got the attention of millions of fans. You've probably got bettors in the numbers of hundreds of thousands. So there's a lot of money to be played. And so there's a lot of money to pay a player to do that, right, at that level. Well, if you go between Dallas and Fort Worth, there's not enough money to pay any player to do anything. So I don't think it ever got down to a minor league level that you'd have to any concern because there was never any money involved to do that.
As far as the public goes, you can kind of trace, and this is more of a speculation on my part more than anything that I have in hard fact, but it seems like to me you can basically track Texas and gambling through its laws on horse racing, through parimutuel racing. That's where you can kind of see where we swung back and forth on it. And I think that baseball, is just is always like an under the table kind of thing anyway, like the Super Bowl office poll now or whatever,
Do you have a question?
Yeah,
Oh.
I was curious about alcohol in the stadiums back in the old games. I would assume that you couldn't get a beer at these places.
Didn't it
right?
depend on the city?
I can tell you what, I've got pictures from 37 and in the early 40s in Fort Worth, and when you walked in the entrance, you were greeted by the Falstaff man.
So in the 30s.
Yeah, and I'll say this, there's, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, beer is an important part of baseball in minor league professional sports. Not only the sales of, but the sponsorships, all that signage. He'll tell you when you look at the books, you know, you've got to get your sponsorships up, and you've got to get certain concession sales. And if you can't do that, then you can't make it a viable expense. And so that's why I know Abilene, bless her hearts, have tried to have several minor league teams, but they don't sell beer and they can't do that. So they just can't make enough money to keep those franchises up and running.
A lot of it was, you know, the communities. It was a reflection of the communities. You know, Cleburne was, you know, for our town, they really frowned on it. We had a large Church of Christ and Baptist presence, and they fought the Sunday play, but beer was still there, you know, even though it was not really spoken of. You know, it wasn't, you know, we didn't get greeted at the front, but, you know, like at the Negro games on the east side of Cleburne, we had a guy called the bootlegger, and at the end of the game, he showed up selling beer for a quarter and a shot of whiskey for a dime, and they all drinked and talked about the game, and it was just part of that culture. So, you know, it was there, and it was part of it, whether or not the community really frowned on it or not. But you found it. They'd take the hip flask and bring it in and pass it around.
Got a question?
What is
Yes, ma'am.
I know this is a broad question, but just a synopsis of the Dallas team and the history of that team. I know the Cats, but I don't know much about the Dallas.
The history of the Dallas.
There's a
Dallas.
book I'm about to sell you. No.
Good segue there, Mark.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, by the way. You know, you'd have to really trace the history of the Texas League, and we cover it in both books, but, you know, the Texas League started in all the big cities, so San Antonio, Houston, Galveston, which people don't realize is Galveston was huge as a city in Texas back in the early part of the century. And then Fort Worth and San Antonio and Austin. And yeah, so those were the big cities that had professional teams. Dallas, again, had, you know, they had some good leadership early on. You mentioned Doak Walker, or is it not Doak Walker?
Doak Roberts.
Doak Roberts, and several others that kept the franchise going here in Dallas. They always played south of town. They always have good crowds. But there's a lot of more interesting stories. I mean, I can't regurgitate them.
They had some of their community teams. There was a baker's team from a bakery that had national recognition from one of the community teams that would take on some of the semi-pro and even pro teams and really hand their hat to them.
There was we did a little study, and I know we keep kind of referring back to some of the black baseball, but there's always these tie-ins. To his point, there was a Texas Negro League Black Championship. It was amateur, but some of the best players in Texas played on these. And Dallas had one of the better teams. They were called the Dallas Brown Bombers. And I mentioned them because I got to meet several of them. And they all talked about how they would play. All the championship game would always be at Katy Park in Waco. And then when the tornado destroyed the stadium, they had to move it. And believe it or not, that kind of wiped out that league. They just could never get the same draw. They couldn't get the same attention. They couldn't get, you know, to keep that going.
There was a lot of pride. You know, that Fort Worth-Dallas rivalry was really, really huge early on. And, you know, your teams would pop up where railroads were. That's why a lot of the small communities would come and go if they could get enough in the circuit for the turnaround where they could make it happen. But the big cities were a big part of it. And that rivalry with Fort Worth and Dallas was really, really solid back then. And you know, it was amazing to see the fan turnout, big crowds.
Mark, didn't they used to play a doubleheader, a game in Fort Worth and a night game in Dallas, or vice versa?
They would
the Cats and the Eagles.
Yeah, they would, especially late in the season when there were some, you know, they had to make up some games, obviously, but they would do that. And then there was a period in late '60s where, and it's covered in the Fort Worth book, I know we covered in the Dallas book, but Dallas and Fort Worth merged. And they were called the Dallas-Fort Worth Rangers. And during that time, this was the early 60s, they'd play a series here in Dallas, they'd play a series in Fort Worth, and as y'all know, Dallas is quite a bit bigger, so they would get more crowds over here, so they quit playing less in Fort Worth and more in Dallas. And that's why the Fort Worth franchise folded. And
then they played in Turnpike Stadium, right?
Spurs, they built Spurs in 65.
The Dallas Fort Worth Spurs.
Yeah.
And back in the 05, 06, 07 period, they would move a lot of the small community games to Dallas because the league depended upon the ticket sales, because Dallas turned out huge crowds. I mean, just massive.
One other thing to keep in mind is a lot of the major league clubs, even back as far as this, and he mentioned that the Giants trained in Marlin Springs. Waxahachie had the Cincinnati Reds.
White Sox.
We had the White Sox in 11.
The Tigers.
Tigers were down, well, and that's the story I was going to tell.
Oh, okay.
There's a story about the Tigers, and what they would do is the major league spring training would be down here, where they would take trains up through San Antonio, Dallas, and Fort Worth on their way up north, and they would play an exhibition game to earn money. And Ty Cobb came to Dallas, and apparently during the game there was a huge fight. Of course, Ty Cobb was known for his fiery attitude anyway, with Dallas teams. And apparently when he got to the Jefferson Hotel, there were some fans waiting for him, and apparently they tore up the whole lobby of the Jefferson Hotel. And Ty Cobb said he'd never come back to Dallas ever again.
Well, and Frank wrote about this. Didn't Ty Cobb get in a huge fight was it the Adolphus?
Yeah, he had a scrape on the field and.
During an exhibition game.
Yeah, and he carried over to the Adolphus Hotel. And I can't think of the name of the player.
Was it Buck Herzog?
Yeah. And it was like he almost like challenged him to a duel. He was up in the hotel room, and they duked it out in the hotel room
With seconds.
Yeah.
There was a passing reference a few minutes ago about revenue and advertising, and I think it was in connection with the alcohol question. And somebody just briefly said something about when they started selling tickets. I'm wondering if there's a pattern or a point in history that you can point to and say, this is when charging admission became the norm and was expected. And was that at the professional level, or did it also go down to semi-pros?
Day one in 1888.
In both, yeah.
It said day one in 1888.
Both of them, yeah.
I mean, you can't have a professional team and pay players without getting revenue in.
Even at the semi-pro level, you had admission.
Pass the hat.
We had
pass the hat.
Yeah, they would pass the cigar box in Cleburne, and some of the kids would slip under the stadium and try to sneak in and do all that. And I was amazed when we started the Railroaders back, looking at how things were in 1906 and how they are today. And while things have changed dramatically, they're still the same. Teams come and go based on revenue from the ticket sales is a big part of it, and the sponsorship was a big part of it. You'll see pictures and stories of sponsors and billboards out on the outfield. Hit it here, win a suit, or win a pair of shoes. And the fans would pass, the hat around, and they would, sponsor that. So it all goes hand in hand.
You got to remember, guys, these are teams that have to pay basically leases or upkeep or maintenance year-round, but you're only in business 4 months a year. I mean, it's difficult, and so you've got 4 months to hit it hard, make as much money as you can to help carry you through the other 8 months of that.
And today, they still don't make money. I've got players that don't have enough to even put food in their mouth. They're playing for that shot to keep playing the game or to make it on. So
and that's why the blue laws were such an issue, because there's no Sunday baseball, and there wasn't any much night baseball. I mean, the games were. The night baseball only came in really the late 30s and the 40s, and so the games were all played in the afternoon, and everybody's at work 6 days a week.
Actually, the first Texas League game, I'm going to say, it was 1931 at Katy Park. Mm-hmm. And if you go down to the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in Waco, they actually have one of the light bulbs that was used, and it's about that big, and the bulb's about that big on that. Use that line.
I was going to say that the Paul Richards Stadium in Waxahachie, if you want to take a break and get off I-35 sometime, is it's only about 5 minutes off the road. It's a great They've maintained the park very, very well, and then named it after Paul Richards, who's from Waxahachie. But that's the stadium where the Reds, the White Sox, and the Tigers at various times conducted spring training right
And
there.
if you were really crazy and you go down to Marlin and you go south of town, it's about, I'm going to say, 12 blocks of nothing to get out there. There's one ticket booth that's left. You can see the corner, and you can see where the tree line where fences were one time, and there's one ticket booth left. And part of Christy Mathewson, a pitcher, wrote a book called Pitching in a Pinch, and he has a whole chapter called Marlin Springs. And the reason why they would train there is because Marlin had these hot springs, and they had these so-called, I don't know, what do you call those? I guess spas.
Baths.
They
call them
baths.
Right?
But he said that John McGraw would make them run the railroad track to get to spring training every day. And that was probably a good 2-mile run.
Yeah.
You know what's amazing is I'm sitting here listening to these stories, and the collaboration of pulling the stories together is really amazing. I was in Burleson, another small community south of Fort Worth, and was telling the story about my book and presenting it, and they said, hey, we got a question for you. Here's a 1907 photo of a Burleson team, and they're wearing these Hawaiian shirt dress looking things. Do you have any idea if that was at the Cleburne Park? And I just started laughing. I said, I can tell you the story behind that. That story, that was actually not that they had lost a bet. They had beaten the Cleburne team in 1907 and won the right and privilege to wear these Hawaiian dress-looking things because in 1906, the Rhetorical Society, the fans that followed Cleburne, wore that to get into the head of the pitchers on the other team. And so it's been really neat, sharing these stories all across Texas where we're able to connect the dots and having the privilege of coming to an event like this, and you learn so much more. It's like you were saying, Clay, we could write another edition by connecting the dots.
Easily.
Good time for one more?
Yeah, one more question.
How about standardization of equipment? For example, the ball. There has to be a lot of variance in the early days about the balls at the different levels. Do you have any data to...
The golden age?
Well, just for record, it's still going on. They've changed the Major League Baseball. They've changed it 3 times, I think, in the last 6-7 years. College baseball went through a huge change when they went from we call them the ping bats, because the big barrel aluminums that you used to,
Had a trampoline effect.
The exit velocity off of those would kill somebody.
Yeah.
And so when they went to the lighter bat, they were using the same ball, and they were getting nothing. And so they had to change the tightness of the stitches and balls. So, I think the evolution of catcher's equipment, the balls, bats, I think it's always...
We have, it's interesting, in our museum, I've got a 1930s catcher's outfit, and I'm negotiating with the Rangers to get one of Pudge Rodriguez's catcher's outfit to compare the differences. A little shameless plug, Pudge has a really cool story. He wrote the foreword for my book, and he was talking about just the changes, not in the book, but he was telling me about changes in equipment. And you're right, it's just constantly evolving, and they're finding new things, safer things, and the ball's changing. But for me, the golden age of baseball seemed to be the turning point, when they had to change the dimensions of the field because of Cobb. And in the baseball, from that dead ball era, you look at the stats from that era and what they had to play with, and many times they would catch the ball barehanded. Was more effective than the primitive gloves they used.
The one thing that hasn't changed, and I think this number is right, is the number 52. That's the number of stitches in a baseball, and it's been that way.
100, I think it's 108.
It's 100, okay.
Yeah,
108.
but you're right.
Yeah, that hasn't changed, because whenever the circumference of that baseball, that's how many stitches it takes to go around it.
Yeah. So, been a great panel. I've certainly enjoyed being here and enjoyed sharing hearing these stories. So, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys.